All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's panel. My name is Jorge Acosta Palmer, and I'm the director of the Statewide Training Initiative with Florida Legal Services. We're excited to have you join us today for Enhancing Legal Services for Spanish-speaking clients, a panel discussion. Before I introduce our speakers, I do want to go through some quick housekeeping announcements. This panel is being recorded. You will receive a copy of this recording and the materials via email from Zoom within 24 hours. I will also be posting it on YouTube afterwards, and I'll include the materials, the CLE code, everything will be shared as well. Closed captions are enabled if you need closed captions. This training was approved for CLE by the Florida Bar. We have 1.5 general credits, 1.1 ethics credits, and 0.5 technology credits. So this panel is so diverse and we have so many topics that we have a little bit of everything thrown in there. And that code, the CLE code, will be posted towards the end. I actually have it on the slides, and I will also make sure to share it via email as well. This panel is being co-sponsored by the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar, or PILS. I will also include information about PILS and the link so you can learn more about PILS and the different work groups and operating committees that they may have. And final piece of housekeeping announcements as far as Q&As and questions and answers, we do have the Q&A feature enabled. If you want to ask a question, you can go ahead and ask the question and we will try to answer it live. If there are any questions, we can try to wait towards the end. Now, this is a really diverse panel with a lot of different topics. We don't expect to be able to answer every question, but at the very least, we want to be able to get that conversation started and make sure that you get to know all these resources and who to ask the correct questions to. So this is going to be a really interactive webinar. So we're going to have a few polls come out in a few minutes. Feel free to use the chat. We really want to engage the audience to be part of this panel. And with all of that said, I'm going to do a quick introductions of our speakers today. They're going to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about the type of work, who they are and the type of work that they do. But here with us today, we have Roberto Cruz. He's the managing attorney of the Southwest region for Latino Justice. We also have Nicole Durbin Felix. She's an Equal Justice Fellow for Latino Justice as well. We have Denise Besic, who I happen to know now as my attorney twin after getting to know her. She's a staff attorney and colleague with Florida Legal Services. We have our friends from Florida Rural Legal Services, or FRILS. We have Kevin Sarlo and Joe Romero. Kevin Sarlo is a staff attorney and Equal Justice Fellow, and Joe Romero is a migrant farm worker paralegal. And I'm going to have a different role today. I'm going to be a host, and I'm also going to be your moderator. So I'm going to drop some quick information here in the chat because I'm not going to be able to do it later. So here we go. And with all that said, let's start with our icebreaker. I'm hoping a lot of you are enjoying lunch. I didn't really plan this through, and now just looking at this picture, I am extremely hungry. But let's go ahead and launch our first icebreaker poll. So I want you to identify what's on the screen. So let me go ahead and launch it. It's multi-select, meaning you can select more than one option. So let's go. Let's give you maybe a minute. You have multiple answers there. Have empanada, empanadilla, pastelillo, masa, pastel. If you have others that are not listed in here, feel free to drop them in the chat. Now, fair warning, if you don't answer the one that I want you to answer, I may withhold CLE credit. I'm just saying, I think that would only be fair, but let's see what people think. You can do multi-select. See, results are coming in. Seems like we have a favorite here. And I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. All right, so you should be seeing the results on your screen. The winner is empanada. That would not have been my favorite. Roberto and I could have an 8-hour discussion about whether this is an empanadilla or a pastelillo. Depends on what area of Puerto Rico you're from. But why do I pick this up? Yeah, see, there you go. I do. We could have this discussion, and this could be like an 8-hour debate. And the reason I bring this up as an icebreaker is if we struggle, with these, we have so many ways of calling foods a certain way. We have this happen with a lot of different words, and this comes in with understanding those cultural nuances and impact on client interactions. So this is this is the other word that comes up a lot for us as Latinos. If I say we're gonna do this webinar ahorita, depending on who you are, where you're from, this could mean something completely different. So having all of this in mind, imagine using legal terminology with our clients. So I'm gonna do another poll right now, and I'm gonna ask the audience to translate these terms. So I'm gonna go ahead and launch the term. Again, it's multi-select. So if you're not sure, you can select more than one. And you're gonna have 5 questions. So go ahead and take your time to answer them. We're gonna start with filing, as I'm filing something in court. I'm filing a lawsuit. See which one do you believe is the best one. We also have court, as if I'm going to court. I have court today. We have landlord. Like my landlord wants to evict me. I have tenant. I'm a tenant and I pay rent to my landlord, right? We have eviction. So we have these 5 common legal terms that most civil legal aid attorneys probably handle on a day-to-day basis. So let's see. Some results are coming in. I know I just gave you a lot of questions, so I'm gonna allow people to continue to answer. If you see, if you have another option, feel free to drop those in the chat as well, because these are just some of the quick options that we came up with. There may be more options that we didn't really think. So. Right, so see a few answers. Let's go ahead and end the poll and share the results. All right, so we have for filing, the winner is the one with the highest percentage is presentar, which interestingly enough, it's not the first one that I would have chosen. I typically say radicar. But radicar sounds a little bit formal, right? So this is where this comes in, cultural nuances and impact on client interactions. For court, we have the winner, tribunal, won a little bit of over corte. I've had it happen a lot of times where my clients will say corte. I know it means the same thing. Landlord, let's see, this one can be controversial because the winner here was propietario with 53%. It got the highest percentage. What's interesting about propietario, I want to ask our panelists, if you're a Spanish speaker, what do you think propietario can also translate to?
For me, I could say propietario means owner and arrendador means landlord.
And something that is very interesting when you look at landlord and tenant and the word arrendador, one thing that I was taught in law school, arrendador, like door is big, arrendatario small. So it was a landlord, tenant. So the tenant is the left guy. And you will see that with a lot of Spanish terminology. And I did add in here a landlord. The reason I bring that up is that when we discuss legal issues with our clients, sometimes we have to make adjustments and we have to use a lot of Spanglish. So it is pretty common for us to have to say something like el landlord. With tenant, I mentioned arrendatario. Roberto also mentioned arrendatario. The winner is actually inquilino, which is what I believe to be the formal term, inquilino. Both of them are correct in that sense. And eviction. This one might be one of the most controversial ones. Desalojo, desahucio, evicción. I don't think evicción is actually like a legal word. I just think it's how we say it, and most people understand what we're talking about. And my favorite, están botando, which is they're kicking you out. It's that the way of saying it. What sometimes when you're talking to somebody like this, what's happening. So I'm gonna at this point stop sharing these results, and I'm gonna ask the panelists to also chime in on some more advanced topics that some terms that I came up with. And if anybody in the audience wants to drop in the chat what they think some of these mean, go ahead. And let's start with mobile home. Any ideas? Anybody? How would you say how Joe or Roberto? Anybody? How would you say mobile home if you were talking with a Spanish speaker?
Casa móvil.
Casa móvil, trailer.
Joe, you got trailer. That's the one that I hear the most. el trailer, and we see Lisa here in the chat say el trailer. And that's commonly how I've heard it. Casa móvil, we talk about a mobile home being mobile when it's not really mobile, but these are some of those nuances that we like to hear about. Injunction. We have a lot of family law attorneys here that handle domestic violence. So how would anybody here say injunction in Spanish? And the audience, you can go ahead and drop it in the chat if you have any ideas.
I would say interdicto.
Oh, you went fancy, Roberto. I like it. Oh, and I have Mia and Maribel. I know them well, and they're going with the one that I like. And Jeanette, I see orden de protección. That's one that I use very often, but I love that Roberto brought up interdicto because injunction typically means an order, right? And we're so used to hearing injunction for protection. Injunctions can be a lot of other things, right? You could have an injunction against a government agency. So that's where Roberto's interdicto may come into play. So I actually heard a friend the other day talk about OP. I'm like, oh, orden de protección. It's the initials, basically, the acronym. Here, I'm going to go a little bit more advanced, and not a lot of people are going to know this. Assuming. Assume is breathing down my throat. They're calling me every day. What's asume? Does anybody know what asume is? If you have a client speaking Spanish to you or they start mentioning asume, do we know what that is? See any of our panels? Anybody knows what asume is?
Oh, somebody in the chat has it.
And Wendy for the win. Puerto Rico DOR. Very good. Asume is the child enforcement agency in Puerto Rico. So whenever somebody tells you about asume, that's what they're referring to. They're basically referring to our DOR. And finally, Ley 54, Law 54. Kind of similar. Let's see if anybody knows. I know one of our panelists knows because I did ask earlier. So let's see if anybody in the chat. Does any of there we go, Roberto in the chat. You did post it for the host and the panelists. Roberto, come off mute and go ahead and give your answer, which is the winning answer.
So in Puerto Rico, the Ley 54 or Law 64 is a statute that allows for the court to issue a domestic violence order of protection. So everybody just says Ley 54 thinking that it's a common term, but yeah, it's basically a law in Puerto Rico.
You're right, Roberto. That's why we bring up these terms. We don't expect everybody to know the answer to these questions, but it does come up often, right? You're having a conversation with a client. They will say they would use these terms because this is what they grew up with. And the same way I had that term of ahorita. Imagine telling a client, you have to file this ahorita. But do you mean like right now, or can I do it later? Did I already do it earlier? It really, it could really have an impact on how you work with clients. So we just wanted to use this as an icebreaker, and just kind of put it out there. I can have this conversation with somebody else, and I don't know if in other Latino countries you have different terms for these type of orders or government agencies. But yeah, it does happen, and it really goes a long way when you're having these conversations with clients. So I kind of wanted to open it up to the panel here for the next maybe 5 minutes or so on just to, if anybody wants to chime in on these type of conversations and your prior experience talking to clients. I'm gonna go ahead, Joe, if you want to chime in. Anybody wants to chime in, go ahead.
I would say, in talking to clients who are renters, which is mostly what I have been doing the last couple of years, the language, the words that you use when you're talking about the landlord maybe have changed over time because so many properties, even individual rental homes, are owned by corporations now. And I find that if you talk to somebody about the propietario, they really are thinking about the owner, and their answer often is, I don't know who the owner is of the building that I live in. I just know, Mary who works in the office. And so I think over time, as the situations that our clients live in change, sometimes the words that we use and that they use also change.
that's something that we see all the time. We have to adapt right at that moment, having that conversation with the client. I don't know about any of you, but I think in Spanish and I speak in English. So it can be a struggle at times, when we're thinking things through and trying to speak to clients. So you will see before we move on to the next topic, you will see this pattern today where we're going to discuss some topics. I'm going to go ahead and mention a few resources that are related to that topic. These are not the only resources related to that topic. Not only are these resources going to be on this slide, they're also going to be included in a separate document where I'm compiling all of these. And I always reference the standards for the provision of legal services. Those are like my favorites. I feel like they fill in the blank for so many procedures and best practices. And in particular, I was interested, I'd start Googling like different glossaries. And it was really interesting to find, these are not the only ones, these are the first ones that came up, but I found multiple Spanish legal glossaries for different states. There were times when I would look up certain words and they would all actually have a different translation. So that's something to keep in mind. And sometimes we think, oh, let's create our own glossary from scratch. You might want to look at what other states and other counties and other cities have already done. Maybe that's a great place to start when you're trying to look at these resources. And I also went ahead and added an article in there. So with all that said, let's move on to our next topic, which is the effective use of interpreters and bilingual staff. So the spotlight on this topic, there's gonna be a spotlight on hotlines and helplines. And this is going to go to Denise Bessick, my colleague here at Florida Legal Services. And Denise, I want you to share a little bit about your experience working with interpreters and bilingual staff in a legal aid setting. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jorge. And thank you, Jorge, for putting this together and for organizing everything in such a useful way. So now I'm working at Florida Legal Services in our Alachua County Eviction Prevention Program. But I am new to Florida. I worked here years ago at Florida Rural Legal Services when I was first out of law school and worked in the Immokalee farm worker program. But most of my career in the last 15 years has been in Illinois. And I worked at Prairie State Legal Services, and one of my roles at Prairie State Legal Services was as the language access coordinator for the organization. And also I was primarily responsible for a number of years for our Spanish language intake and advice line. So at that time when I was in that project, if you were a Spanish speaker in the 36 counties that we covered in Illinois and you applied for our services by phone, you probably talked to me at some point. So my experience working with interpreters and bilingual staff in a legal aid setting stems from that role as language access coordinator, but also in my years litigating both domestic violence and landlord-tenant cases.
So I wanted to ask you, because I would experience this all the time. Can you talk about some key strategies and best practices when it comes to using interpreters in different settings? Whether it is there's a client calling a helpline or you're doing an in-person interview with a client, maybe it's a court appearance. So the typical scenario is you might have somebody calling like, hey, I have a friend with me, or do we use staff members? Do we use an interpreter service? So can you speak on your experience and your tips, best practices when it comes to that?
Sure. So I think when it comes to most legal aid programs, language access and the use of interpreters is not only an issue for providing adequate services to our clients, but it's also a civil rights issue because we receive, most of us, funding through the federal government in some way. And so language access and providing adequate services to limited English speaking clients is a national origin civil rights issue. So it's really important to think about providing access to our clients so that they are able to fully use our services. And so one of the ways to do that is, so we need to provide access to our clients in the language that they speak. That's a given. And The ways that we can do that are in-person interpreters, bilingual staff, telephonic and video interpreters. So using interpreters effectively in our agencies depends a lot on how we intake our clients, and what language our clients speak. So this, this group is aimed at effective services for Spanish-speaking clients. Spanish-speaking clients can be served either by bilingual staff or through interpreting services. And obviously it's best to provide services to clients in their own language with bilingual staff. That means having staff available who are fluent in Spanish, who are, if we're talking attorneys who are experienced in the type of case that the client has. And as we all know, especially over time, with the kinds of, with the administrative issues that come with this, with grant provision, right? And because we have specific because we usually assign specific attorneys to specific case matter, it's not always possible to have clients who have attorneys who speak Spanish. And so sometimes we use bilingual staff as interpreters, which is a great idea, but we have to keep in mind that interpreting is not the same as speaking to somebody in their native language, because there is that aspect of taking somebody else's words that are not your own words and explaining those words to the client. And so we need to make sure that we train our bilingual staff, if we're using bilingual support staff, on the specific arts of interpreting. Do you have a follow-up question?
Well, I do have them on the screen, but basically the follow-on question: can you come up with examples of common challenges that you've encountered working with interpreters, whether it's a staff family member, an interpreter service, and how do you address those challenges?
I think, a common problems that attorneys run into in working with interpreters are that attorneys often are not trained to work with interpreters. And so attorneys often will look to the interpreter to lead the conversation instead of the attorney leading the conversation as the attorney would with a client who's English speaking. And for example, attorneys who are not trained to work with interpreters might talk to the interpreter instead of talking to the client, might not explain things as they would to an English speaking client because they're relying on the interpreter or the bilingual support staff to provide the explanation. So that's a common problem, I think, that attorneys who are not bilingual encounter, because they don't have an understanding of what the interpreter's role is supposed to be. And the way to overcome that in your program is to, as part of your language access program, provide training for both attorneys and bilingual staff on the proper use of interpreters. Explain that interpreters are there to, and this kind of seems kind of simple, but explain that interpreters are there to take the attorney's language and translate that into the client's language, but not to change it or interpret it or add or take anything away. Also, training for attorneys on using interpreters can involve something as simple as understanding where the interpreter should sit and how the interpreter should interact with the client during the interpreted interaction. For example, if you're talking to somebody in person, it's always better that the interpreter sits near your client instead of near you. That way you maintain eye contact with your client, and the interpreter maintains eye contact with you. Just something as subtle as figuring out where the interpreter is going to sit really can go a long way in directing the conversation and keeping the the conversation on track between the attorney and the client, because the client's looking at you, you're looking at the client, and the interpreter is sitting off to the side, and really providing that the interpreting service as opposed to being the focus of the client's attention.
We have a great question here that is related to this topic here in the Q&A, and the question is, how do you manage the use of interpreters for bilingual staff who are not truly fluid or fluent on the interpretation? You know, it's not 100%. It kind of goes into the quality of the interpretation, which can be a challenge at times.
So the question, if I understand it, is how do you manage interpretation when bilingual staff is providing the interpretation, but they may not be familiar with the terminology, or they may not be familiar with the process of interpretation? Is that the question?
Yeah,
So
basically, they may not necessarily 100% fluent either. Like maybe there's it kind of goes, I guess, into the quality of whether they properly translate.
So in the agency that I worked at when I was language access coordinator, we handled that in two ways. First, and probably most important, is that we provided training to our bilingual staff on what it means to be an interpreter, how to interpret, and had them do a language self-assessment before they agreed to work as interpreters. We also put we empowered our Spanish speaking staff, especially because most of our bilingual staff were Spanish speaking. We've empowered our Spanish speaking staff to accept or reject an interpretation request. And we provided our attorneys with options for telephonic interpreting, video interpreting, and in-person interpreting that they were able to access without question. A lot of agencies feel that hiring an interpreter is expensive, right? And so attorneys feel like they are not supposed to go outside of the resources provided within the agency, and that they have to rely on bilingual staff, which puts pressure on the bilingual staff members who feel that they might not be equipped with the particular language or the nuances of language that they would need in order to provide the interpretation, both in English and in Spanish. So empowering attorneys to use other resources is really important, and empowering bilingual staff to assess their own abilities and to accept or decline interpretation requests depending on the subject matter also is important. Another thing that we did was we created an email chat group for bilingual support staff, and we shared resources formally and informally within our organization. Now, we were a pretty big organization, so this worked well for us. But we had a chat group where staff could ask other bilingual staff, how would you interpret this? What are the words for this? And when we were working on in-house translations of documents, we shared those documents among bilingual staff as well to get input, but also to help with legal vocabulary building. A lot of the resources that you shared earlier, the bilingual the glossaries of court terms, we shared those with our staff. We worked with a really great in-person interpreter who we hired to work with our staff on issues of legal language in English and Spanish. And we had periodic trainings where we sometimes would even play act interpreting, so that staff members who were serving as interpreters would have a kind of a safe environment to ask questions, to try things out, and to understand what their abilities and limits were, while they were also growing their abilities and limits.
That's like, I really like the self-assessment idea and the idea of sharing resources. I think a lot of the legal aids and people in the audience face different challenges. some organizations are bigger, so we have the luxury of reaching out to other colleagues who are also Spanish speakers, and we can run things by each other. But some organizations don't have that luxury, and I think that kind of brings we do have a tip towards the end of the presentation about how do we share resources. I love the idea of sharing that chat that you had mentioned. We are like looking at how do we create a shared resource to have these type of conversations where if you don't have somebody within your organization that you could reach out to, so you can reach out to other people in the community.
Yeah,
And I
it's
was
also
wondering
really
if,
important that managers are trained on language access and on interpreting, because it just, not being a native speaker myself, I understand that it is not intuitive to people who are not bilingual, that there are various levels of fluency, both in speaking, in writing, and based on specific terms. And one example that I, would always give to management was, if you asked me the parts of a car engine in English, I wouldn't be able to tell you the parts of a car engine, because that is not, I'm not a mechanic, and that's not a personal area of interest. And it's the same when when you're asking a bilingual staff member to do an interpretation for a tax attorney. Well, that, you wouldn't expect me to know the car parts in English. Why would you expect a bilingual staff member who hasn't been trained on English and Spanish vocabulary and tax law to interpret, and, for a client who is a tax client? And when managers understand those issues, they start to, I think, understand the importance of both skill development for Spanish speaking staff who they want to be interpreters, and self-agency for those staff members.
it's a great point. I wanted to open it up to the panel, and I may be asking Kevin and Joe to chime in here because Denise was covering the hotline model, right? That one-on-one. I was wondering, you guys do a lot of outreach. So I was wondering, how do you address this whenever you're doing an outreach event and you have a large group of people? How would you, what are the challenges that you face, and how would you recommend addressing these challenges?
Well, thank you, Jorge. I'd love to jump in here. I would say that we are getting better as far as the regional offices go. I'm here as a representative of Florida Rural Legal Services regional offices. Joe is with our migrant unit. As far as the regional offices, we are trying to have more of the literature that we bring along with us interpreted into Spanish as well as Haitian Creole. And then we have seen some community partners that are willing to fund in-person interpretation. So I'm thinking of Send Me Missions in DeSoto County. They were kind enough to send a Spanish interpreter for us when we went and spoke at a senior center. And much like Denise was saying, the strategy there was to have the Spanish speakers kind of clustered in one area. That way that they could be directly interpreted to. And we were really thankful for that. But we would like to have more in-person communication in somebody's native language, which is something that the migrant unit is really great at. So I'm going to toss it over to Joe.
Joe, you're muted. Let me go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I was muted. I guess my thing is, in person most of the time, 90% of the time, on the outreach. And the only, I guess, problem with the interpretation would be when there is a group of people that came from, Guatemala. They do have they have several native languages that they speak, and their Spanish is not their first language. So that is a challenge, when I'm out there. And they say they're from Guatemala. Sometimes they don't understand some of the Spanish that I'm speaking to them, or they might be from Salvador, Honduras, and but Overall, I think, we're still able, well, myself, I'm still able to get the information across, the basic information across to them, and I guess we did ended up having a group of people from Paraguay, which, their language was very similar. It just had a nice accent to it. But other than that, I mean, I'm still able to get the information across and still be able to understand them because it's in person. So try to, use other words that will also, be defined as what they will use.
And
Yeah.
Roberto, Nicole, anything that you would like to add here based on your experience dealing with interpreters or bilingual staff?
Yeah, I just like Joe was mentioning, when we're looking at language access, we usually focus on Spanish and Creole, uh, but there are other native languages that we sometimes struggle to accommodate when it comes to providing services. So having a language line definitely helps with this endeavor, and I recommend, if you don't already have it, to have the numbers of a language line company for these kinds of situations.
I will say that at the agency that I worked at, we used Language Line, and we had a secondary language access service. And our attorneys had access to that at all times on their cell phones with our call codes. When I was working in the courthouse in an on-the-spot eviction defense project, I used Language Line on my phone pretty frequently. People in the Chicago suburbs where I was working, there is a very diverse language population, and I used Language Line for Ukrainian, for Russian, for Polish. It's really readily available. There are some languages that Language Line can't accommodate quickly, but you'd be surprised at how many languages and how many dialects of those languages Language Line can accommodate with a 5-minute phone call. And it's, over time, because I've been doing this work for 15 years, over time, the interpreters at Language Line have gotten more diverse and I think more skilled. And years ago, we used to get complaints from our staff about problems with Language Line interpreters. But we taught our staff how to talk to the interpreters and tell them what's expected, so that they knew if it seemed that they were having back and forth conversation with our clients. We taught our staff to kind of reel the conversation back in and make sure the interpreter knew that they needed to interpret everything the client was telling us and not ask any additional questions without telling us what those additional questions were. And that worked really well. So if you have a concerted effort to Roberto's point, if you make a concerted effort to use those services, they really do work well.
And Denise, I'm gonna give you a bonus question here based on our previous conversation. It's something that a lot of the legal aids encounter a lot. A lot of legal aids are LLC funded, other organizations are not, and citizen eligibility can be a barrier towards receiving services. And I just, based on your hotline experience, I kind of wanted you to chime in on navigating non-citizen eligibility for services, since you have a background of both LLC and non-LLC eligibility.
So I think, most LSC organizations and probably most non-LSC organizations use Legal Server for their intake, right? And so when you're using Legal Server, if you follow the Legal Server questions and drop-down menus, you should be able to do this pretty well. To be eligible for an LSC program, you have to be a US citizen, a lawful permanent resident, or fit into one of a bunch of other categories. And I think it's when it's one of those bunch of other categories that the person fits into, that intake staff and attorneys who are doing intake might get a little confused because they're afraid to violate the rules and they don't really know what the questions are. And there's a reason why you don't know what the questions are. It's because the LLC rules don't necessarily follow immigration statuses. Because there are a lot of people that are eligible for legal services corporation representation that don't actually currently have any legal status. There's this broad category, and under Part 1626, there's a broad category of people who are essentially people who have applied for a status that is going to lead to lawful permanent resident status, and they have U.S. citizen children, or they're married to a U.S. citizen. And in those categories could include people who have an asylum application pending, even though they don't actually have asylum, which would, asylum people who have asylum would be eligible for LSC services. So training your staff on how to ask the questions after our U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident, I think is really important. I think it's a civil rights issue. I think that we can't deny people services because we don't know what questions to ask them to find out if they're eligible. And more people are eligible than you may think. So, empowering staff by giving them proper training. And I think it's also a good policy to have a person in your agency who understands these rules pretty well and who's readily available to answer questions for staff who need those questions answered quickly, like because they're screening somebody for a hotline assistance, or because they're out in the field doing an in-person intake. And then, asking people questions doesn't violate legal service corporation rules, right? Telling somebody that you're, figuring out what they're calling about and telling them that you'll call them back to let them know about their eligibility doesn't violate the rules. So keeping, understanding that you can take some time to figure out what the answer to the eligibility question is much better, in my opinion, than assuming somebody's not eligible because you don't know the questions to ask them.
On that point, I did add in the materials, I have them up on the slides. I did add that regulation that Denise mentioned, 1626. If you're not LSC, I will probably say if you want to nerd out on this, it's a pretty long statute. It's a little bit confusing to read. Sometimes I feel like I need to read it backwards to understand it, but I did add an eligibility chart. And the reason I asked Denise to talk about this topic is because I understand the struggle. You're talking to somebody over the phone and they give you a code or a status, and then you have to go through a really long list that doesn't always match up. And that can be really frustrating. And imagine you have somebody on the phone that you really want to help, and it could cause a delay in services. So as Denise mentioned, being familiar with these statuses and how they're codified, it could really go a long way. So, and I see here a comment from Chrisia. Thank you for that segment. That is an internal issue. And I will add, on top of the regulations, I would encourage everybody to go look through these regulations and the program letters. Every legal aid will have their own internal policy on how to implement the regulations. So that's always a great conversation to have with other organizations. Denise is the best on this topic. If I could pick her brain for as much as I could, I would. And that's how I kind of got this conversation started with her. And I was like, you need to be a panelist here. So we're going to move on to the next topic, which is really connected to the effective use of interpreters and bilingual staff. And it's something that we've actually mentioned, implementing language access solutions. And for this topic, we're going to put a spotlight on something that we've all recently been impacted by here in Florida, which is navigating disaster assistance. And I'm going to pass it on to Nicole Durbin Felix. She's the Equal Justice Fellow with Latino Justice. So Nicole, can you share what is the obligation of federal agencies like FEMA to provide individuals with language access during the time of a disaster? And what remedies, what can somebody do when these federal agencies are not providing language access solutions?
Thank you. So as you guys know, Florida has been heavily impacted, as has lots of the United States, by recent disasters. And with increasing frequency of disasters, we really, this has become an increasing problem with everybody. So during a disaster, getting the right information really can quickly save a life, whether that's an emergency alert, whether you're able to get access to federal benefits to try to rebuild your home. And for individuals who speak limited or no English, it's crucial to know that FEMA and other emergency services offer language assistance to make sure that families understand exactly what to do. So I'm going to be focusing on FEMA a little bit because that's the federal agency that has certain obligations. So language access under FEMA, under their definition, means that people who don't speak English well can still get information and services in their own language, such as like translation of documents, access to interpreters without any cost to them. And this helps ensure that all families are protected and informed during an emergency. And they define an individual with LEP, limited English proficiency, as someone who doesn't speak English as their primary language or who has a limited ability to read, speak, write, or understand English. FEMA must provide reasonable steps to provide individuals with LEP with meaningful access to all programs or activities. So that meaningful access is really that key critical part. And it's both FEMA and programs or activities who receive funding from FEMA. What exactly does meaningful access mean? It means language assistance that results in accurate, timely, and effective communication at no cost to the person with LEP. So the meaningful access can't be significantly restricted, delayed, or inferior as compared to programs or activities provided to English proficient individuals. Some examples include free written translation of documents or oral interpretation services from qualified interpreters to disaster survivors. One key thing that I really want to note is that kids should not be interpreters. Like, I know a lot of people, myself included, I've had to help translate for my grandfather. That should not be the case. So FEMA and other organizations make it clear that children should not be used to translate important information. There's trained interpreters that can absolutely do this. The DOJ LEP guidance makes clear that children must not be relied upon to serve as interpreters and translators, only under extenuating circumstances as a very last resort while awaiting interpreter services should children be used as language interpreters. So FEMA at various points should be asking your clients about their language needs, whether that's in a disaster recovery center, whether they're trying to fill out the application, or whether they're calling FEMA's helpline. There's various points that they can try to get that assistance. And even if they don't initially identify that they have this language need, they can always call the helpline and identify it later. And this also includes like reasonable modifications if someone requires the use of American Sign Language or video relay services as well. So if FEMA doesn't provide this language assistance, people do have remedies under FEMA to provide or to file and contact the External Civil Rights Division and make a complaint. And the complaint has to be filed 180 days after the alleged discriminatory action. That's when the clock starts. So there are remedies out there. They were a little hard to kind of identify, but they do exist.
Well, I was gonna ask, and you kind of answered it, but I was gonna say, how early does this obligation kick in? Like, I show up at a DRC and I'm asking around in Spanish. Does it kick in there? Do I have to do anything in writing? How does that work?
So when people are interacting with FEMA, whether that's at the disaster recovery center, whether they're calling FEMA to try to put in an application, if they're asking questions about their application, all those points, they should have access to that meaningful access as well. So also FEMA's website does have some pages in other languages. If you go on their website, I think it's like 27, 28, I don't remember the exact number off of my head, but if you're going to look for resources as well, that website is supposed to have all the languages available, and they have the helpline that you can call. It's like FEMA in my language. If you go to the DRCs, the recovery centers, sometimes they might have a little sign that says I speak, and then someone can identify what language they're speaking.
I know some of these questions are kind of generic, but can you touch on like what are the common challenges? Maybe use some examples based on the recent hurricanes. One off the top of my head, one challenge that everybody has been facing has been there's a lot of misinformation. So if you're already dealing with a lot of misinformation out there, I guess it's even harder when you have to deal with misinformation in another language. So can you kind of touch on those challenges and how would you recommend those challenges are addressed?
Absolutely. So I know there was a lot of misinformation going around the last hurricane. For example, there was a text going around that if you say like, yes, I need FEMA help, someone was supposed to get $1,200. And that's simply not true. Obviously, you do have to go through FEMA and try to do the full application. So people share that in Facebook. So getting the right information is definitely critical. And that also goes to getting like alerts in Spanish, making sure that, or other languages, making sure that people know whether to evacuate, where to find disaster recovery centers. A couple challenges that I think are really big are the access to bilingual workers at recovery centers, or difficulty filling out the application online in someone's native language. Sometimes people can go to a disaster recovery center and there may not be someone that speaks Spanish or Haitian Creole or American Sign Language or Puerto Rican Sign Language, and trying to get FEMA to help them in their native language may take a little extra time. Trying to fill out that application may be difficult for them as well. So the other one that I think is really critical is accessibility when someone comes out to the house to complete an inspection of the house. So after you fill out a FEMA application for services, FEMA will come out to your house and inspect for damages. One example in Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico is that FEMA workers were going out that didn't speak Spanish. So that's obviously a huge barrier. And then also there was a lot of reports of FEMA workers that couldn't get access to Puerto Rican Sign Language because that's different than American Sign Language. So having that language barrier right off the bat, and you can't necessarily explain where your water leak was coming from, or if you had cleaned up where all the damage came from, that's huge. So, and also on top of that, you have the difficulty of if you're trying to utilize video relay services, cell phone towers are down, there's no Wi-Fi, trying to get that. So that's another big challenge that exists.
And Roberta, I was gonna ask you, I know you commented here in the chat with the host and the panelists, if you wanted to chime in on the comment and talk a little bit about that experience here with Hurricane Ian.
You know what? I will reserve my comment on my section because it kind of it is part of my presentation. So yeah.
Sounds good. And Nicole, you had mentioned, that I was gonna open it up to how can legal aid offices or organizations work effectively, sometimes preempt when we know a hurricane is coming. How do you plan? How do you coordinate not only with government agencies like FEMA, but other community partners to be able to assist during those recovery efforts?
So I would say making sure that people know what rights they have before disaster is really key, because as soon as a disaster happens, people are worried about their immediate needs. Their legal needs are kind of on the back burner, whether or not they have a roof over their head, whether or not they have water or food, or, basic necessities are in that initial time period. So if they know about their legal rights beforehand, for example, about if someone's a renter, what rights do they have afterwards? We've really been focusing on community education and outreach and trying to have give that information out to make sure that people are prepared whether or not they have a little flyer. That's why we did some webinar series as well. That way they live on the internet. And when someone needs it, hopefully they can find it. So legal aid offices, they can also, sometimes the DRCs will let people in, attorneys in, and help people fill out the applications. If they're members of the community trying to reach the rural areas, that's really helpful too, trying to get people that are bilingual staff out to those rural areas, because that is a very big challenge as well. So that's just one thing. Or trying to help people with the FEMA appeals process as well. FEMA application and appeals are difficult to manage. And so if you can help either nonprofits or help individuals in that appeal or application process, that would help too.
We do have a question here in the Q&A. It's a great question, and Denise answered. So Denise, I'm probably going to call on you. I'm going to read the question out loud for the benefit of the audience. And we have, I use courthouse interpreters when they need pro bono time. Is there any training for law students to serve as interpreters? In regards to disaster, we have a disaster team dedicated to assist both English and Spanish speaking clients. And Denise answered in the Q&A. At my ANC, we created our own training for support staff and volunteer interpreters. If you would like to reach out to me for ideas about how to put together a training, please do so. I kind of like that idea of using law students. I remember when I was a law student in Puerto Rico, everybody spoke Spanish, but it is one of the topics that we have towards the end as potential ideas on how to move forward. Working with community partners, law students, Hispanic bar associations. There's already a lot of translated materials out there, which I'll show you what we've found so far, and how to cooperate with other organizations. So I was wondering, has anybody worked with, as far as putting training materials together, has anybody worked with pro bono attorneys, law students, or other community partners when it comes to trying to interpret or provide services to bilingual folks?
One thing that is difficult when dealing with law students and using law students as interpreters is that you really have to, the interpreter role is not an advocacy role, and the interpreter role is not a fact gathering role. So if you're going to use law students as interpreters, you want to train them on what the interpreter role is. That's a great role. It's a great experience. It's a great way for law students to have something active to do while, especially 1Ls, to have something active to do while they're observing, because they can't, do a lot of legal work on their own, and they don't, in the legal aid realm, oftentimes have a lot of client interviewing experience. So interpreting is a great way for 1Ls especially to observe those things that they would be observing as part of their internship, but also having a more active role. So training them as interpreters requires them to understand what the interpreter role is, and requires them to think about the language that they're using, and to do some research about the legal terms in English and in Spanish. So I think it is a great role for law students. I'm not aware of any training that's commercially developed that's out there, but I'm happy to share pointers on what we included in our training for support staff and volunteers. And I think that that would be applicable to law students, especially in like a courthouse clinic setting.
Right. So I'm gonna move on to the next slide because I do have some resources. The way I learned about Nicole was by attending this amazing webinar series. Part 4 specifically was on language accessibility during disaster. So the materials, I'll have the link included in the materials. If you want to kind of watch that webinar later. Nicole, do you want to do a plug for that webinar series?
Sure. So that was part of a 4-part webinar series where we talked about common issues that arise after a disaster or beforehand. So the first one, we talked about insurance issues, how to get insurance, what exactly can generally be covered or excluded. We also talked about tenant rights after a disaster. We talked about like contractor fraud, because a lot of the time after a hurricane, people will come door to door, and that creates an issues with fraud. And the last one that we talked about, obviously, is the 4th and final one about language accessibility. And all of those webinars were translated. We had a live American Sign Language interpreter, so they're available in Spanish, English, American Sign Language, and Haitian Creole.
And I've added additional resources here on the slides. The first one here is serving older adults with limited English proficiency. This came from Negler. There's a lot of organizations and listservs out there that provide a lot of great materials. This is one of them. This was actually a recent webinar that they held. So in the materials, you're gonna find a copy of their recording. On their website, they also have a lot of great materials as well. On that topic of providing, federal agencies providing language access, I did include a recent article about healthcare and how this also comes into play in other settings. I included a recent toolkit that I found at, I believe this was from the Self-Represented Litigant Network listserv, another great listserv to join and get resources from. And as we were talking about this panel, I've had a lot of community partners and other organizations share some of their materials with me. One that I found, and this was pretty recent, given that October is Domestic Violence Month, and from September 15th through October 15th, you have Hispanic Heritage Month. They recently translated a lot of documents that could be really helpful for domestic violence survivors. So this is just an example of a resource that is out there that, as we get these, just let's do our best to share these with the rest of the community. At another meeting during the disaster umbrella group, one of the attendees from United Policyholders informed me that they're actively translating their website. So doing a quick plug for them in here, it has a lot of great information. So they're actively updating the website. So there's another resource that's available out there. And I'm gonna put this out there kind of quickly, something that I stumbled upon. And as a former legal aid helpline attorney, I would rely on FOcourts.org a lot. If you're not familiar with FOcourts.org, they have a great self-help website where they have for family law specifically, they have every form that you would possibly need, right? It has instructions, it has like, it's designated by number, it's pretty organized. But these forms are in English only. We don't have these forms in Spanish. And obviously you can't file forms in Spanish, but it would be really helpful for litigants if they had the instructions in Spanish, or if they had like something to the side where this is what you're filling out, so you understand what you're filling out. So kind of want to open it up to the panel with any ideas here. And Denise, I'm going to start with you because I know we had discussed this, and based on your prior experience, how would you approach this? Any ideas on how to approach these self-help forms?
Yeah, so in part of my prior life in Illinois, I was on the Language Access Committee of the Equal Justice, the Access to Justice Committee of the Administrative Office of Illinois Courts. That's quite a mouthful. But what we did was encourage the courts to follow the Supreme Court language access policy in Illinois, which required that key documents be translated to Spanish and to other languages that had high diffusion in Illinois. So we started with Spanish, and we had our court forms and the instructions to the court forms translated into Spanish, and then Polish, Russian, and I think Arabic was the other language that they were working on. And so the forms that are available at floridacourts.org in Illinois, over time, they were all translated. People there was an instruction page that was translated, the actual form was translated, and people were instructed that they had to file their documents on the English form, but they knew what to put in the blanks because they knew what the form said in Spanish or the other languages that they were translated into. Honestly, this is not a huge endeavor. You can hire LanguageLine to do this for you. They might charge you $100 a page, but once it's translated for all time for all people who want to use it. And these forms are not a lot of pages. These are, for pro se litigants, and they're designed not to be complicated. So once we had them translated, and we did them little by little, it didn't happen overnight. It wasn't that they sent out every form, in one day to be professionally translated, but they hired a professional translator, translated them, and there they are on the website for everybody to use now.
We had other suggestions in the chat. Don suggested using this could be a pro bono project as well to get volunteers involved. And Chrissy has just shared a resource from Georgia as well. And this looks really, really, really good. I love this because this is part of the idea of this panel, sharing these resources. And what Denise just said, she's 100% spot on, right? Like it's the same form, it's the same, it will benefit everybody. So it's a great way to pull resources and achieve these results for our clients. So gonna move on to the next topic. We're kind of on time. I'm surprised. I thought this was gonna go a little bit longer. So the next topic is service delivery models to achieve strategic impact. And we're gonna do a spotlight on voting rights. And this topic is going to be handled by Roberto Cruz. He's the managing attorney for the Southwest region of Latino Justice. And while I'll pass it on to him, I'm going to ask him a question, but I'm curious if anybody knows what does PRLDEF stand for. Jump in the chat. Let's see to do your best guess of what that stands for. I know what it means because I kind of cheated earlier, but I would have had a hard time guessing what it meant. So Roberto, thank you for being here today. Can you share your experience with service delivery models at Latino Justice that aim to achieve strategic impact, particularly in areas like civil rights, voting rights, and immigrant justice?
Sure. And thank you to everyone for joining us today and discussing access to legal services for the non-English speaking communities. Just to give you a sense of what my role is and what is Latino Justice. We are a non-LSC funded public interest law firm. And our headquarters are in New York City, but we do have regional offices in Texas and here in Florida. In terms of answering the question, we first need to look at some of the common legal theories of change, some of the traditional models that you see out there when it comes to service delivery. And we're basically looking at 5. The first one would be access to justice. These are the LSC-funded nonprofit organizations, your community legal services, your Miami-Dade County. Then you have other models like law reform. These are legal defense funds, and hint on Jorge's question, legal defense funds. Some examples of legal defense funds would be Latino Justice Pearl Deaf, Unidos Us, formerly MALDEF, the NAACP, LDF, and the ACLU. They're more focused on making significant changes in the law. We're talking impact cases and systemic issues. Then we have the model of rule of law. So we have your local bar associations. Then the model of democratizing law. These are your court navigators. Jorge and Denise just spoke about floridacourts.org. This is one of those court navigators that you can find. Also, peer mentoring falls under democratizing law. So you look at organizations like the National Reentry Network for the formerly incarcerated. So this is a peer-peer organization that helps people in the same circumstances. And then finally, you have social rescue. These are your case managing agencies. We're talking about your Catholic charities where you can, it's a one-stop shop. You go there and you get food, you get legal assistance, you get a social worker to manage your case, and maybe some affordable housing. Next slide. When we're looking specifically at Latino justice, we're kind of moving away, along with other organizations, from these 5 common legal theories of change, and we're adopting a community lawyering model. Under this model, lawyers and organizers, community organizers, engage directly with the people that they serve. And they start building relationships in order to ensure that legal strategies align with systemic changes. Interestingly enough, we got Joe here. Joe is an organizer, and we also have Kevin, and Kevin is the attorney. And they both work for Florida Rural Legal Services. Joe is out there looking for the people, getting their stories, and Kevin is in the office writing the briefs in order to help them out. And in this community lawyering model that we have adopted, the organizer and the attorney are seated at the same level. Lawyers are not the heroes, the community is the hero. Now, in terms of civil rights, voting rights, and immigrant justice, we use these community lawyering principles to help us develop a strategy to deal with systemic issues. One of these examples comes from our voting rights work. Now, we do have an election protection program known as Cada Voto Cuenta, which mobilizes bilingual volunteers and legal monitors across several states like Florida, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and New York. We have tackled issues of voter intimidation, language barriers at the polls, and preventing vote denials. And the good thing about this kind of approach is that we don't necessarily do it ourselves. Latino Justice usually partners with other organizations. Just to give you an example, this year, Latino Justice partnered with the League of Women Voters of Florida to identify voter access violations, language accessibility issues, and voter intimidation or suppression activities, and other barriers in Seminole County, where we have identified a need for our assistance. Now, if you want to contact us, first, we got to take into consideration that we deal with systemic issues. So when we look at clients, we look at clients that don't necessarily have a matter that is specifically tailored to individual needs, but that affects a whole community. So if you have a client with a systemic issue or an impact case, you can have them contact us through our direct outreach. We do have a hotline. The number is on your screen. They can also go to our website, latinojustice.org, and fill out an application. And most of the times, what we do is get referrals from members of coalitions or organizations, and those organizations would make sure to contact the appropriate person to start engaging in a practice. So that's essentially the answer to your question, Jorge.
All right, so now I want you to tell me a story, but before I do, I'm gonna go ahead and launch a poll here. Let's see, polls. To the, sorry, let's give me 1 second. Found it. Okay, so everybody go ahead and answer that question if you're familiar with this bill 7050. It basically bars any non-citizens from working or volunteering with organizations who register eligible for the units to vote. So as your answer, I'm kind of gonna give you the answer. The link to the bill is right there. But here's the story time. So May 2023, Governor DeSantis signed this bill, which bars any non-citizen, regardless of their lawful residence status, from working or volunteering with voter registration organizations who register eligible for Floridians to vote. So, Robert, tell me a story. What happens next?
So Latino Justice, along with some of our partners, we're talking organizations like the NAACP, Hispanic Federation, the League of Women Voters, the ACLU, and some others. We understood the critical issue that would impact some of these voter registration organizations. Now, if you know a little bit about our community, this presented a significant challenge to organizations that hired non-English speakers to reach out and help out with voter registration. It placed undue restrictions on community groups that rely on volunteers, including lawful permanent residents with deep ties to the community, to register eligible voters. So Latino Justice and our partners, we responded by challenging this law in the matter of Hispanic Federation versus Byrd. We argued that SB 7050 citizenship requirement was discriminatory. We emphasized that it violated the Equal Protection Clause by discriminating against non-citizens, and how it restricts free speech and civic engagement. Fortunately, in May of 2024, the United States District Court for the Northern District of Florida ruled in our favor, blocking this provision permanently and protecting community-based voter registration efforts. The matter is on appeal in the United States Court of Appeal for the Fifth Circuit in Georgia. So this is still unsettled law. However, we do expect a favorable outcome from this litigation. And this success underlies the importance of community lawyering and kind of the new strategy that we're moving forward. So thank you. And for those who were waiting on the answer of Pearl Deaf means the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. That was the name that we started with back in 1972 when the organization was created. But then as we started growing our influence and becoming more inclusive, we changed the name to Latino Justice. So there's your answer, Jorge. Thank you.
You know what, Eduardo, that brings me to something that has happened to me. I don't know if any of you have ever had to do this, but let's say you're trying to provide your email to a client, and trying to provide your contact information in Spanish. Like I've actually asked them, like, give me your email and I'll email you immediately. I just thought about that, and that's a mouthful. A lot of people got the answer right in the chat. So thanks for sharing this great story with us. This is a great victory, and it just kind of shows that community lawyering aspect where we have a lot of civil legal limited in some ways, but how they can work together and refer cases to other organizations that can undertake this type of impact. All right, and I did put in here again one of my favorite resources, the ABA Standards for the Provision of Legal Services. This is one of my favorite sections. If you kind of go through all these, it covers a lot of the topics that we've discussed today. You look at that idea of the one-on-one, right? You have the helplines, you have the delivery to communities where we talk about that outreach. And they do talk a lot about community lawyering, which is a big aspect. And it kind of wraps up with the delivery to affect effective systemic change. So last topic, and addressing legal needs specific to Spanish-speaking communities. And for this one, I'm gonna call on Kevin Sarlo and Joe Romero from Florida Rural Legal Services, or FRILS. I don't know if you guys call yourselves FRILS, but I find it a little bit easier to say. So I don't know who wants to go first, Kevin or Joe, but feel free to unmute yourselves. But basically, I was going to ask you, can you provide us an overview of FRIL's farm worker program and the types of legal services it provides to farm workers? What specific legal needs and what common challenges to farm workers specifically address? So, Kevin, you're up.
Sure. And yes, we do call ourselves FRILS. It rolls off the tongue a lot easier than Florida Rural Legal Services. But the migrant farm worker program at Florida Rural Legal Services is, part of it is part of our origin story. It is our origin story, in fact. Our organization goes back to the 1960s, and one of the very first causes that we got behind was the deplorable conditions for farm workers in one of our interior communities, Immokalee, in Collier County, Florida. And I think that the migrant farm worker unit is a model of what I, in my practice in the disaster unit, try and do, which is meeting people where they're at and actually going into the communities. And, because of that, I really want to highlight Joe and all the work that he does, being the literal boots on the ground. Joe, why don't you tell us about, some of the ways that you interact with our local farm worker communities here in our service area and statewide?
Well, one of the ways, am I on mute? No, right? Okay.
Nope, you're good.
One of the ways that I interact is, of course, by going out there, to the community, the different camps, and talking to organizations to collaborate and work together in providing, different types of assistance, whether it's food, clothes, housing. Some of those programs, sometimes they have some money for housing, some money for food, for rent, stuff like that. So I guess overall, just, working together with everybody, whether it's coming, even the sheriff's office. I mean, I'll go and present myself with sheriff's department and ask them if, they can give me 30 minutes of their time, get, most of their officers, maybe in a group where, I can, talk about our organization, what we do. A lot of this sheriff's department had no idea there was Florida Rural Legal Services. A lot of them, they don't know, and the more I venture out there and talk to some of them, they're actually happy. They're glad that there is an organization like us that provides that type of services for farm workers. A lot of times they seen some of those problems themselves. So but of course, I mean, I can be here for hours talking about, every things that we do. But yeah, those are basically it, and like Kevin said, our organization was established in 1966. And, I guess one of our main goals was to provide assistance for less fortunate and agriculture people.
Yeah.
Joe, you
And
just
Joe, is
met,
one visit typically enough, or how many, what
Oh,
do you normally?
yes, yes. A lot of times when I go and there is we used to have an ICERT, back in the day, that now it no longer exists. But now we, thanks to Texas Rural Legal Aid, they actually design, a website where we can actually go in there, and they have a person that actually brings in all the orders. I guess they do a lot of FOIA requests, and they get all the orders from all the United States, and they put them in this website. So it makes it a little easier, kind of like the ICERT, they used to be run by the government, which no longer exists. Now we're able to access through there and find out some of the location areas of, where the houses are going to be. And normally I like to go there at least 3 times in the beginning when they're coming in, and, around the mid of the season and the end of the season, so I can build that trust with the farm workers. And a lot of times they're afraid to talk in the very beginning. So a lot of times it's not convenient to ask any, questions regarding their employer. Just go there, hand the material, talk about the organization, put a card in their hand, and maybe the second time going in over there, maybe talking about, how's everything, how's your work, how's, you're getting paid everything on your contract, and that's when they start getting more comfortable with talking to you. And then at the end, if they want to sign up, because there's no pressure or no obligation, but if they want to sign up and if it's something we can do to help them, they're there's a time, and they're welcome to.
Okay, great. So we're meeting these people, where they're at, in these, in these housing complexes, and then we're also connecting with community partners and trying to build up our trust and reputation. When get people to come out of their shell, what are the legal issues that these populations are facing?
Uh, Wages all throughout the state of Florida, wages, not getting paid their wages. The other one will be housing, sometimes they're not being housed in the proper place where they were supposed to be, or dilapidated housing, broken windows and stuff like that. And the other one will be transportation, whether it's transportation to the laundromat, transportation to Walmart, to the store so they can get their goods. Transportation, a lot of times, the transportation not being adequate either. A lot of times there's this rundown buses that they tell me they can literally see the road, because they're rusting out. They can literally see the road as they're sitting in the bus. So yes, a lot of times the bus is not being inspected or being up to par.
Yeah. And this is something that we mentioned this before. Our migrant farm worker program goes all over the state, right? So you traveled all over the state visiting, communities of migrant farm workers and addressing these issues.
Yes, sir.
Um,
The only place I haven't gone is Key West. I don't think they have farm workers there.
we'll work on that.
Okay.
And you've made many different community partners as you travel across the state. So you mentioned local sheriff's offices, and then farm workers organizations. What are some other community partners that you have encountered in doing this work?
Community partners would be like the Farm Worker Association, COFO, um, the University Extension of South Florida, and they actually educate a lot of the students that are children of farm workers, you know, to be able to venture out from the fields and stuff like that. And other legal services, you know, in the state of Florida and outside of the state of Florida, like Georgia, you know, New York, um, what is the other one? South Carolina, North Carolina, stuff like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Texas Legal Aid, you mentioned that
Texas,
maintains
yes,
the
absolutely.
database.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes, we do. We do actually communicate with Texas Legal Aid as well. And you know, we try to share resources or ideas.
Yeah. So the service area for the farm worker unit is all across the state. You know, going down this list of questions, as far as the eligibility criteria goes, it has to be LSC eligible, correct?
Eligibility, yeah, U.S. citizen, LPR, H-2A, H-2B, depending on, you know, the type of crop or work. Victims of a crime, in farm worker, if they're a farm worker, even if they're like domestic farm worker, depending, you know, it's like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so we'll be able to maybe help them with that.
Okay, great. And then finally, I know that you have some, you know, great success stories in your program. Is there any stories that you can share with us about successes that you've had recently?
Try to make it short, yes. There was once upon a time a grower down in the Lake Placid, Avon Park area that displaced a lot of Black Americans. Spent there, you know, a little over a year, you know, getting everybody, you know, tracking everybody that worked there. And then we ended up settling out of court a little over $500,000 for all the workers. They were very happy. They were being displaced with Mexican H-2A workers, the Black Americans. And a lot of them have been, you know, throughout the state of Florida. Now I notice that we've been seeing that they're getting out of the agriculture. A lot of the, you know, Black Americans have been getting out. So there's not many at this point. Another, I guess, story was in the area of Palatka. There was a crew leader that actually hired what are they called, homeless shelter, people that lived in homeless shelter. He went there and started looking for homeless shelter people that were in there and put them in his migrant camp. Migrant camp had barbed wire, and the times that we went there, it was difficult to get in. You know, there was always like a security guard there, and but to make the long story short, yes, that person ended up getting convicted. His family got convicted, went to prison. FBI got involved on that case, and the workers were able to get some restitution. But that guy had like 20 counts of giving them crack cocaine, giving them drugs, guns, cigarettes, booze, you name it, everything. So that was another case that uh, it took a while, you know, to get to them, and that's why the outreach actually is very essential. Is very helpful to go out there and find them, you know, see where they are, because if we wouldn't have done that outreach, we would have never known, you know, they were there for 6 years already, you know, being mistreated, these people, and good thing we were able to find them. But that's why I like doing the outreach, because there's a lot of stuff um, that I learned, and you just don't see it by not doing the outreach.
Yes, outreach is a really important part of what we do. And, you know, the model that's used by the migrant team is something that we've adapted in our disaster team, which is where I work a lot. And like I said, we just really are trying to meet people where we're at. You know, we might have been around, we might have been in existence since the 60s, but there are still people in the community that don't know about us. So we need to connect with those partners, you know, and not just, you know, geographically, but in the language that they understand. So that's why we're making an effort to have, you know, our materials translated into native languages whenever possible, to, you know, send bilingual paralegals or staff to these outreach events, so that you know, we can have that interaction with people. We also have Language Line, and while Language Line is great, nothing beats having that in-person, translation, or to be able to speak to somebody face to face in the language that you're most comfortable with.
Kevin, nail on the head, like that. You hit it like perfectly. And you mentioned something that I was gonna ask whether you covered. Rose already covers 13 counties, so if that's not enough, this program covers the entire state. So if you're at another organization, another civil legal aid, and you didn't know this, it's another opportunity, to collaborate with another legal aid organization and possibly offer additional services to the clients that you serve. Here on the slide, I put some information about the farm workers program. They had Kevin and Joe mentioned eligibility and how it works. Here's the number that I found on the website. I've also included the website section, and that's a great page where they have information about how to apply for legal services, but it also has some really amazing client stories on top of the ones that Joe just told us. It feels like it's Halloween, so we got some horror stories, but with a good result. Originally, this was supposed to fall within Hispanic Heritage Month, but Milton didn't really help out. But thank you again, Kevin and Joe. I know we're at time, so I do have a few final slides to kind of go through and wrap up. I'm still surprised that we managed to kind of wrap it up right at 1:30, but to kind of wrap it up, last few slides. These are some other topics that we had here just in case. We're not going to go through them, but we wanted to put it out there. On voting rights, fresh out of the oven, como pan caliente. This case just came out of the Supreme Court yesterday. It's a Virginia case. And it's basically the Supreme Court is temporarily blocking an order by a federal judge that would have required Virginia to return more than 1,600 people to the voter rolls. So basically, this is the type of case. Obviously, it didn't happen in Florida, but I'm just putting it out there as an example, because if anything like this were to happen in Florida, I would probably be like, Roberto, what's going on here? Let's see what happens, right? So it's sometimes these things happen in other states, and maybe it could happen in our state. So just kind of putting it out there, right? One of the topics that we mentioned quite often today was immigration and non-citizens. And this is one of the areas where it can be a struggle sometimes, where you have, as much as we would like to, sometimes we can't find a way to go around certain regulations, and we can't necessarily qualify somebody. So identifying, service providers, who else can we refer to? Roberto mentioned earlier Catholic Charities. That's one of the go-tos, right? So another big topic that could be its own training is public charge. Whenever we deal with non-citizens, understanding how when we go through public assistance, whether it's disaster benefits, subsidized housing, rental assistance, understanding public charge and how could it possibly impact somebody's eligibility or immigration status, right? So you might want to, we don't have the answers for all those, but just kind of putting it out there. That red link, it will take you to some guidance on that topic. And this was one that I kind of put out there, and this was one I was going to ask Roberto about it. It's kind of a scenario where Bob, recently evicted client, right? He's in Florida. He was recently evicted. His only income is SSI. What is it now? Like 750, 800. It's only that. And Bob's like, you know what? I've had it. I'm moving back to Puerto Rico. I have somewhere to stay. And I have somewhere to stay, and I can afford on my limited income. So any red flags? Roberto, can you talk a little bit about this scenario?
Sure. So let's discuss Bob. So it's a client relying on SSI who plans to move to Puerto Rico for affordable housing purposes. This definitely raises an immediate red flag. Under current law, SSI is not available to residents of Puerto Rico, which would likely put Bob in financial jeopardy if he were to relocate. This actually ties to one of the missions of Latino Justice in the matter of United States versus Baello Madero. Our senior counsel, Leah Fiol-Mata, filed our amicus brief before the U.S. Supreme Court, and this case was heard, amongst others, by Latino Justice's former board member, Justice Sonia Sotomayor. But just to give you a sense of what the Supreme Court had to review, we had Mr. Baello Madero, a U.S. citizen who had lawfully received SSI benefits, while living in New York. Madero lost his SSI when he moved to Puerto Rico because of federal law. He challenged this exclusion, arguing that it wasn't constitutional to deny benefits based on residency. He's still a U.S. citizen. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. While the Supreme Court ultimately upheld the federal government's exclusion of Puerto Rican or residents of Puerto Rico from SSI, the case did bring significant attention to discriminatory parity, and it raised a lot of critical questions about equal protection and the need for reform. As a Puerto Rican myself, the issue kind of like resonates deeply. Bob in this scenario could be Roberto or me. Those who know me, and I've seen some of the audience members that I know, and they know about my family situation. I did move to the United States with my son, who has autism, to access some specialized services that are not available in the island. Case in point, SSI. Now today, my son does receive SSI. He lives in a group home, so affordable housing is not an issue. And interestingly enough, he does work as a farm worker in Apopka, Florida. It's very interesting how what life does to you. So I definitely thank Florida Rural Services for the work that they do, and I thank all the public interest lawyers that handle these SSI cases. This is the reason why I became a public interest lawyer. So thank you for that question, Jorge.
To kind of wrap this up, I did drop the the CLE code in here. I'll show it off in another slide, so it kind of puts at this point like, what do we do moving forward? We've already discussed sharing resources and ideas. We're thinking about possibly putting some sort of listserv together, because rather than looking at a substantive area, we would be looking at a vulnerable population, right? So how do we share this type of information? We kind of floated the idea of maybe doing like a quarterly cafecito break, where it would be something similar to a panel like this one, but we could just do it like an open meeting for everybody to share emerging issues, ideas, whatever's working. I have to plug in the public interest law section. If you're not a member or you're not familiar with it, make sure to take a look at it. Hispanic bar associations could be another great resource to, not only get involved, but put the word out there, create awareness, which is a big part of all of this, and having other people volunteer, whether it's pro bono attorneys and law students. And with all that said, this is the CLE code. You're gonna get a CLE credits for a little bit of everything, it feels like. You have general credits, ethics, and technology. So we have a great diverse combination in there. The materials, the slides that I used today are going to be in the materials. I will be adding more. I have a Google document that I can turn into Word as well, with a lot of links to all these materials as well. So I know we went a little bit over that was expected, but I did want to take the opportunity to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. It was truly an honor to host this panel. I've been wanting to do this for a while, and I'm really happy that this worked out. And if any of the panelists, if you have any like closing statements before we wrap up, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that in the Florida Legal Services YouTube page, there is a segment on mental health awareness. So if you want to look at a video that I did while I was with Florida Rural Legal Services on this topic, make sure to go to their site. Thank you.
We did get a question about, do we get a copy of this recording? And the answer is yes. If you're registered, you're going to get an email automatically within 24 hours. If for whatever reason you missed out and you were not able to register, no worries. We will also be posting this on YouTube as well. If for whatever reason you can't find the YouTube page, or you can't find a copy of the recording, feel free to shoot me an email. I'll drop the email right here. And Denise, I think you wanted to say something. So while you chime in, I'll go ahead and drop my email here.
I was just going to thank you, Jorge, again for organizing this great group of panelists and this very diverse presentation. with the work that we're all doing and things that affect our Spanish-speaking clients. It's really great that you put this together for us all and brought us all together to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you all again. You did the hard work. To me, this is fun. So I know a lot of people in the audience know me. I've had the privilege of working in some sort of way with everybody on in this call. So thank you all again, and happy Hispanic Heritage Month, 15 days after it ended. But hopefully you can enjoy your Halloween. And if you have any questions, suggestions, feel free to email me, and we'll keep growing this community. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.